A child dies for a few minutes, and upon returning reveals a story so scary even the doctors were shocked. She didn't see a tunnel of light. She felt no peace. Instead, she was dragged into a dark place where shadows whispered his name and a mysterious presence gave him a terrifying warning. What's on the other side? Are we prepared to hear what this child saw? After crossing the line between life and death, her parents didn't believe her at first, but when she started describing details she could never know, fear took over everyone. Experts tried to explain, but nothing made sense. Was it a delusion, a supernatural revelation, or a secret we were never supposed to discover? What this child said when he woke up goes, change your beliefs and your view of death. But one thing is certain, you will never see life the same way again after this story. Get ready, because this is the story that could change your perception of what really exists after the last breath. Are we ready to hear the truth? And if this message from beyond is an urgent warning to all humanity, what this child said after returning from death may leave you speechless. But only those who watch until the end will understand what really happened. Some experiences are impossible to ignore. What this child saw in the afterlife could change everything we know about death and what awaits us on the other side. Leave a like now, because this revelation needs to reach more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are still deep mysteries about near-death experiences that you need to know about. Now brace yourself, because what you're about to hear could be one of the most disturbing experiences ever recorded. Emily is just 6 years old, an American child full of energy, laughter, and dreams. His parents would never have imagined that, on one ordinary day, their lives would change forever. Emily was no different from any other child. Playful, curious, she loved exploring her backyard, running through the school hallways and getting lost in her favorite stories before bed. But one fateful afternoon, all of this was brutally interrupted. It was a moment that seemed to last an eternity, and at the same time it happened in the blink of an eye. A tragic accident. Something so sudden that not even his parents were able to react in time. One oversight, a split second, and then everything fell apart. Emily drowned while playing in a neighbor's pool. An instant of distraction, a moment where time seemed to freeze, and then silence. When they realized, it was already too late. The small, fragile body floated motionless in the water, with no signs of life. Despair took over, screaming, running, shaking hands trying to pull her out, trying to make her breathe. The parents' hearts were beating in their chests, as if they were going to explode. They called the paramedics, who arrived within minutes but felt like ages. And there, on the cold floor, a professional tried to revive her. Pressures in his chest, air being blown into his lungs, as the clock ticked mercilessly. Emily was clinically dead. Time passed. The heartbeat did not return. No pulse, no breathing, no response. Science said that there was no more hope, that the damage could be irreversible, that even if it came back, it could never be the same again. But then something happened. Against all odds, against all medical logic, she came back. The paramedics couldn't believe it. Emily breathed. He coughed. His eyes slowly opened, dazzled by the lights and silhouettes of the people around him. Her mother cried, hugging her as if she would never let go. The doctors were relieved but surprised. She came back to life, but something was different. Emily didn't just look disoriented or confused. She was scared. His gaze, so childish and bright before the accident, now seemed lost somewhere far away. Her little body was shaking, and she was holding her mother's hand tightly. In the first moments, no one knew what was happening. Everyone thought it was just trauma from drowning, something natural after going through such an intense event. But then she started talking. The first words that came out of his mouth were cold as ice. Something that made his mother shudder, that made even the doctors stay silent. I saw a dark place and they were waiting for me. What did Emily mean by that? Who they? What exactly did she watch as his heart stood still, as his soul floated between life and death? Instead of a comforting account of a tunnel of light, a reunion with deceased relatives, or a feeling of love and peace, Emily told something completely different, something no one expected to hear, something that made his mother pale and feel an inexplicable cold run down her spine. The words came out shakily from the child's mouth, but each syllable was like an echo reverberating in the room where she lay. She described a dark, cold, suffocating place. There were no vibrant colors, no angelic beings, There was no feeling of relief or comfort. On the contrary, what she experienced was fear, a fear that even now, as he was back in the world of the living, still seemed to stick to his skin. She spoke of faceless shadows, tall, distorted figures that whispered her name. "They knew who I was." His voice was low, as if he were trying to shake off the memory. "They were waiting for me, and I couldn't move." Her mother tried to calm her by holding her to her chest, but the girl was in shock. What did she see should not be seen by a child. What she described, it wasn't something someone his age could come up with. How could a 6-year-old create such a disturbing narrative? The doctors exchanged discreet glances. They had already heard reports of near-death experiences, NDEs, before. Many patients described visions of a tunnel of light, encounters with angels or deceased family members. But Emily's account was different. He carried a weight that no one could explain. What did she see? Where did she go during those minutes when her heart stopped? Science has always tried to understand NDEs in a logical way. Many believe that they are just illusions created by the brain in a moment of failure, hallucinations caused by a lack of oxygenation. But there is something inexplicable about reports like this. How can we explain the fact that so many different people in different cultures report the same experiences? How to explain when a child sees something who shouldn't know? If Emily had made all this up, why was she still scared even after waking up? Why did she avoid sleeping, afraid of going back to that place? The days passed and Emily began to give even more details. Things that made your parents lose sleep. Things that no one could just ignore. And now the question remains, what really happens after death? What did Emily see in that brief moment between life and the unknown? Stories like this have the power to transform our view of life and death. Share your perception in the comments. Write, "I want to know the truth," if this revelation aroused your curiosity. Your opinion is essential for us to continue exploring these mysteries. Emily closed her eyes. Time seemed to have stopped. Everything around him disappeared in an instant, and absolute silence took over his existence. Suddenly, a weight she didn't even know she was carrying was lifted from her body, and a strange feeling came over her. She was no longer there. The first thing he noticed was the lightness. His body no longer existed in the same way. She felt suspended in the air, like she was floating, but at the same time, there was no air. There was no ground. There was nothing. It was a feeling of freedom, but also of total disorientation. She opened her eyes and saw herself, but from an impossible angle. She was looking down, seeing her own body limp, lifeless, surrounded by doctors and nurses who were desperately trying to bring her back. Her mother was kneeling on the floor, hands over her face, crying, as a paramedic said something she couldn't hear. There was a despair in their eyes, as if with each passing second, the chances of recovery became smaller. Emily tried to speak, tried to scream to her mother that she was okay, that she was there, but no one heard her. She felt a mixture of confusion and panic. How could I be seeing all this? How could he be there, floating, while his body remained motionless? It was like being in a dream, but at the same time everything seemed too real. It was then that he felt it. Something was wrong. There was a presence. A strange cold began to envelop the space around him. Before, even with the confusion, she felt a certain neutrality in the environment, an absence of extreme sensations. But now everything has changed. The air seemed to have become dense, heavy. Something was looking at her. Emily felt a force pulling her back. She wasn't abrupt, but she wasn't gentle either. It was as if something invisible enveloped her, sucking her away from that scene. She tried to resist, tried to fight, but there was nothing to hold back. All she could do was let herself be carried away, as her spiritual body was dragged to a place she knew, didn't choose to go. The hospital, his mother, the doctors, everything started to disappear. The voices became distant echoes, growing fainter, until there was only silence. And then, darkness took over. Emily couldn't say how long she stayed in that void. Minutes, hours, days. Time no longer made sense. But one thing was certain. She was not alone. At first it was just a whisper, though almost imperceptible, like the wind passing through the leaves. But as the seconds passed, the whispers grew louder. Voices, many voices. Some were crying, others seemed to laugh distortedly. But the worst part was that they said his name. Emily. The girl felt a shiver run through her being. There was no light. There was no glowing tunnel guiding her to a place of peace, like so many other stories. near-death experience, NDE described. What she found was shadows, and they seemed to know exactly who she was. The voices intensified. Now it wasn't just whispers, but murmurs, laments, disjointed words that mixed and echoed around him. She wanted to run away, but where? There was no way out. The space around him was infinite and claustrophobic at the same time. She was trapped. Emily tried to close her eyes, but realized it didn't make any difference. The dark was still there, constant, absolute. It was then that he saw the first movements around him. Shadows began to appear slowly, as if waking up from a deep sleep. They moved in a strange, distorted way, as if they were trapped in a reality that did not obey natural laws. And then, one of them approached. Unlike the others, this shadow was sharper, more solid. Its shape was indefinite, like a silhouette shrouded in mist. But Emily knew it was she was looking at her. He felt the invisible eyes of that entity piercing his soul. The shadow extended a hand, or something that looked like a hand, and Emily felt an even greater shiver when she realized that it wasn't a threat. Not at that moment. It was an invitation. Come. The voice did not come from a physical place. It came from inside her. It was not a spoken word, but a felt one, as if the entity didn't need sound to communicate. The word echoed in his mind, as if it had always been there, waiting to be perceived. Emily didn't want to go. Something inside her screamed for her to run, but how can she run when there is nowhere to go? She felt the invisible force again, slowly pulling her forward toward the shadow. It was then that something changed. Far, far away, a glow appeared. Small, almost insignificant, but it was enough to break the darkness around him. And at the same moment, the light appeared. The shadows retreated. The surroundings seemed to shake. The voices became more agitated, as if they were scared. They feared the light. Emily felt the pull again, but this time in the opposite direction. Something was calling her back. The shadow in front of him tried to move forward, but hesitated. The glow, although faint, seemed enough to stop her from getting any closer. The feeling of being pulled increased. The world around him began to spin, and in the blink of an eye, she was back. Suddenly, the hospital, the doctor's voices, his mother's desperate breathing, everything came back at the same time. Emily opened her eyes, and the first thing she felt was an intense cold running through her body. He was shaking, his skin was crawling, his heart was racing. She came back, but what if it was still there, waiting? Emily opened her eyes, but she wasn't in the hospital. The glow that was pulling her disappeared, as if it had never existed, and darkness enveloped her again. The absolute silence was now filled with whispers, voices that overlapped, some whispering her name, others crying, moaning, murmuring disjointed words that she couldn't understand. Fear was growing inside her, freezing her skin, or at least the sensation of what was once her skin. She tried to move, but she couldn't feel the ground. It was as if he was floating in an endless void. The space around him seemed alive, pulsating, as if there was something there, hidden in the shadows. Then a presence stood out. A dark figure, denser than the others, began to approach. Emily felt a deep shiver. She knew that thing was looking at her. It had no face, it had no eyes, but she felt his gaze piercing her soul. And then she heard. The voice didn't come from outside, but from inside her, like a thought that wasn't hers. You shouldn't be here yet. Emily felt her heart, or what felt like her heart, speed up. Fear mixed with confusion. If she shouldn't be there, so why was it? Who brought her? The figure stood still for a moment, and then everything around him began to change. The shadows fell away, revealing something much worse. The ground beneath his feet, or what felt like the ground, began to form. But it wasn't solid, it seemed to be made of ash, moving like sand in a windless storm. The air was heavy, suffocating, filled with something she couldn't identify, but that made her chest tighten as if she were breathing smoke. She saw silhouettes on the horizon, shadows of people hunched over, as if trapped in an eternal cycle of suffering. Emily tried to move away, but realized that the place was alive. Something was crawling around the edges of this world, something that didn't want to be seen, but that was there, waiting. And then, the voices changed. The wails turned into choked screams, as if those figures were trying to warn her of something, but their mouths were locked in a forced silence. She tried to cover her ears, but the sound was coming from inside. And then again, the voice. You can still come back, but you need to listen. The ground beneath her shook, and she saw something that made her want to close her eyes forever. A rift opened, like a crack in the very fabric of reality. Inside it, Emily saw scenes, images that moved as if they were projections on broken glass. She saw fire. She saw people who seemed to call out to her. She saw familiar faces she should never have seen there. Among them, a face that made her freeze. It was his grandmother. She had died when Emily was very little, and the girl barely remembered her, just some old photos she saw at her mother's house. But there, in that crevice, her grandmother was looking right at her. Her chin was trembling, and her eyes were filled with a sadness Emily had never seen before. Emily wanted to call her, run to her, but then the grandmother's expression changed from supplication to despair. She shook her head, as if she were trying to warn Emily to get out of there. And then something pulled her back hard. The space around her seemed to collapse. The shadows screamed in unison, and the dark figure that had previously spoken to her, he approached too quickly as if he were trying to stop her from leaving. But it was already too late. Everything went out. And then she woke up. The white light of the hospital obscured his vision. The sound of machines beeping, muffled voices, the warm touch of her mother's hand holding hers. His body was there. She was back. But something came with her. The doctors were relieved. They talked about a miracle, about how I shouldn't have survived after being unconscious for so long. Her mother cried with relief, holding her against her, repeating, "You're back, my girl. You're back." But Emily knew it wasn't that simple. She felt it. I still felt it. The weight of that place was still on her like an invisible blanket that wouldn't let her breathe. And worse than that, she knew something was still watching. That night, when her mother finally fell asleep in the armchair next to her bed, Emily closed her eyes and saw. Ali, no canto du quarto. The shadow was there, property, observing. And she whispered once again in her mind, "This isn't over yet." Experiences like this challenge everything we know about life and death. Share your vision in the comments. Write, "I believe," to show that these experiences are real. Your opinion is essential for us to continue exploring this mystery. Emily came back, but she was never the same. Her body was there in the hospital, alive, breathing, warmed by the touch of her mother, who was crying with relief. Doctors spoke of a miracle, a rare case of recovery after such a long time without vital signs, but no one knew what really had happened while his heart was still. Nobody but her. In the first moments, everything seemed like a blur. The voices around were distant, as if they were coming from a very far-away place. But little by little, the sounds became clearer, and the hospital became real again. But something was wrong. The light was too bright. The sounds were too loud. Everything felt out of place, like she was caught between two worlds. And maybe he was. At first, doctors attributed this feeling to the traumatic experience she had gone through. They told her mother that it might take a few days for Emily to fully recover, that her body needed time to process everything. But it wasn't just her body that looked different. It was in mind. The apple. The first strange thing happened that same night. Emily closed her eyes, exhausted, trying to sleep. But once he did, she was no longer in the hospital. She found herself back in that place. The dark place. The place where she had been pulled back at the last second. The shadows were there, observing, waiting. She woke up screaming. Her mother ran to her, trying to calm her down, but Emily was shaking, panting, looking around the corners of the room, as if looking for something. When her mother asked what was wrong, all Emily could say was, "They were here." From that day on, the fear never left her. She didn't want to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, she saw things she shouldn't see. Strange dreams, faces that seemed to call her, voices that echoed in her mind, even when she was awake. And, above all, that presence that never left her. The first week after her discharge, her mother noticed that Emily didn't want to be alone anymore. She refused to sleep in her own room. Every night, she curled up in her parents' bed, clinging to her mother, looking at the door as if waiting for something to come in. When they asked what was wrong, all they said was, "I don't want to go back." Her mother tried to comfort her, told her that she was safe, that it had all been just a nightmare. But then Emily started counting details that no one could explain. She talked about that place, about the shadows, about the voice that said she shouldn't be there. It said something brought her back, but that others they wanted her to stay. She talked about the crack, the vision of her grandmother's face, the sad eyes that seemed to beg her to get out of there. At first, his mother thought it was all the imagination of a traumatized child. But then Emily started saying things she could never know. One morning, while playing alone in her room, she began to hum a melody. The mother, as she passed through the door, felt a shiver. That song, it was a song her mother sang to her as a baby, but which Emily was never supposed to know. There was something more, words that Emily had never heard, but that came out of her mouth naturally. One night, she said something in her sleep, in a language that no one in the house knew. His mother recorded the audio and showed it to a linguistics professor, who confirmed that it was an ancient prayer in Latin, but Emily had never learned Latin. And then, the drawings began. Her mother noticed that Emily spent hours scribbling on sheets of paper without saying a word. The drawings were always the same, shadows. Shadows with empty eyes, outstretched hands, shapeless figures surrounding something in the center. And then one day, Emily drew something that took her mother's breath away. In the middle of the shadows there was a face, a woman's face. The features were familiar, as if they were an old but vivid memory. Was Emily's grandmother. Mum held the paper with shaking hands. How could Emily have drawn this? The girl only had 1 or 2 photos of her grandmother, all in black and white without such clear details. But there she was. In the pencil strokes, in the eyes filled with deep sadness, the exact way Emily saw her during her NDE. When her mother asked how she knew how to draw that, Emily answered without hesitation, "She showed me." Months passed, but Emily remained changed. Before, he was a happy, talkative, curious child. Now she was silent, observant, as if she were always listening to something no one else could hear. And maybe he was. She began to feel presences even during the day. He said that he saw figures in the corners of the rooms, that he felt a sudden cold whenever he walked through the hallway of the house. Sometimes she would suddenly stop playing, as if she heard someone calling her. But when her mother asked, Emily just said, "It wasn't you." The nightmares continued. Every night, the same feeling, being pulled back, as if that place had never forgotten her. One night, his mother woke up to a strange noise. The room was in silent gloom, but something was wrong. He turned to see if Emily was sleeping next to him. The bed was empty. Despair took over. The mother got up, calling her daughter's name, looking around the house. He went to Emily's room and found the door open. And there she was. Emily was standing in the middle of the room with her back turned, facing the dark wall. Her small body trembled. The eyes were open, but it seemed like they weren't there. Her mother ran to her and touched her on the shoulders, trying to wake her up, trying to understand what was happening. It was then that Emily slowly turned her face and whispered something that made her mother's blood run cold. "They said it's not over yet." Emily's story is not an isolated case. As disturbing as his account was, he is not unique. In different parts of the world, children who have experienced near-death experiences, NDE, they described encounters with mysterious entities, dark environments and presences that seem to be watching them. What does this mean? How can children from different cultures, without any contact with each other, report the same things? There is something about these experiences that defies all logic. Science tries to explain NDEs as hallucinations of the brain deprived of oxygen, but how to explain when so many stories carry frighteningly similar patterns? Emily's case leads us to an even greater mystery, because when we look at other reports, we realize that there is something dark and inexplicable happening. In 2012, a boy in France, just 5 years old, also experienced an NDE after suffering a cardiac arrest. When he woke up, he told his mother that he was taken to a place where everything was dark and full of voices, whispering your name. He said he saw faceless beings who seemed to be studying him, as if they were deciding something about him. One of the scariest things was when the child, without having learned English, repeated disjointed phrases in that language which his parents had never taught him. Were these phrases part of something he heard on this other side? Cases like this arise around the world. In 1998, an 8-year-old Indian girl reported that during her NDE, she was taken by invisible hands to a dark place where she heard voices wailing and calling for help. She described beings of appearance dark, who moved in circles and seemed to have glowing eyes hidden in the shadows. After she came back to life, she began to speak of a figure that never left her alone, a presence that she felt it, but no one else could see. In Brazil, a case registered in 2004 caught the attention of doctors and scholars of the phenomenon of NDEs. A 7-year-old boy, who almost drowned in a river, came back describing a feeling of floating above his own body, seeing paramedics trying to revive him. But the scariest thing was what happened next. He said that at the moment when he should be taken into the light, a shadow held him and whispered something in his ear. What was said to him was never clear, but the boy has since drawn strange symbols, which his parents claim never taught him. What draws attention to these reports is that, while many associate NDEs with experiences of light, peace, and reunions with loved ones, there is another side to these stories that is rarely mentioned. Children and even adults report that they didn't see a tunnel of light, they didn't feel peace, but rather a dark void, and voices calling them. Medicine recognizes the phenomenon of NDEs, but cannot explain it completely. A psychiatry suggests it may be a mechanism of the brain in dealing with impending death, creating images and voices as an effect of lack of oxygen. However, if it were just that, why do so many people describe such similar things? And even more intriguing, how to explain when information that the child could not know arises after the experience? Scientists like the Dr. Bruce Grayson, one of the greatest NDE researchers in the world, have already studied several cases and reached the conclusion that there is something inexplicable in these reports. He documented situations in which patients, upon returning from death, reported seeing deceased relatives they had never met in life, and later had these reports confirmed by their families. But most disturbing are the stories where people didn't find light or love, but rather dark places, where strange presences seemed to watch them. The neuroscientist Eben Alexander, who himself had an NDE, was initially a skeptic, but his view changed after his own experience, in which he reported that it left his body and was taken to a place that defied all rational explanations. According to him, there is something in human consciousness that goes beyond brain activity, something that cannot simply be explained by chemical reactions in the brain. What causes some people to have heavenly experiences and others to face what appears to be real nightmares? What determines who sees a tunnel of light and who finds themselves in a place where the shadows call your name? If what Emily experienced was real, it means there are places beyond this world that we do not yet understand. What if these reports are more than just hallucinations? If there is in fact another side, but not the paradise described by so many cultures, but rather something much darker? And the scariest thing, if some of these presences can follow us back. Many believe that dark places in NDEs represent something bigger, a hidden message about what can happen after death. In several religious and spiritual traditions, there are reports of people who have seen what they call spiritual abysses, zones of suffering, or even a version of hell. What Emily saw, and what so many other children around the world have reported, may just be a sliver of something that we shouldn't know. Whether these experiences are real or not, there is still no definitive answer. But what we know is that doctors, scientists, and researchers remain intrigued with the details eerily similar between accounts from different parts of the world. Some experiences forever transform the way we view life and death. Do you believe there is something beyond? Comment, "This is real." Do you trust science? Write, "The brain creates everything." Emily's story, like so many other near-death experiences, forces us to question what really happens after we close our eyes to this world. Was her experience just a delusion of the mind at a critical moment? A trick of the brain trying to protect itself from imminent death? Or is there something much deeper and more real behind these visions that so many people around the world describe in eerily similar detail? If consciousness is just a product of brain activity, then everything Emily saw could be attributed to hallucinations caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain. But what if it's more than that? And if are these experiences glimpses of a reality that our conscious mind cannot normally access? Traditional science has difficulty explaining why so many NDE reports carry common elements. People of different cultures, ages, and beliefs talk about the sensation of leaving your body, seeing your own body inert, encountering entities, and in some cases, witnessing places that defy any rational explanation. For some, the experience is heavenly, a vision of paradise, but for others, like Emily, what awaited on the other side was something much darker. This leads us to an even bigger question. Would the experience after death be different for each person? Or is there a pattern that we don't yet fully understand? In some religious and spiritual traditions, there are reports of people who were rejected by the afterlife and sent back. Some describe encounters with beings of light, while others claim to have been pulled into dark realities, where something was watching them, waiting for them. If these descriptions were mere products of the imagination, why are they repeated so consistently over centuries in different parts of the world? There is also another disturbing detail. Some of these people who had near-death experiences came back changed in ways that science cannot explain. Not only did their behaviors change, but some of them began to report information that they could never have known before. Some return with inexplicable abilities, such as a sudden knowledge of languages they never studied or a more intense spiritual connection. Others, like Emily, return with fear, feeling that something has followed them back, that something is still nearby, watching. This leads us to an even deeper reflection. What determines what a person sees during an NDE? Could the emotional state or thoughts at the time of death influence the experience? Or was what Emily saw a revelation of something beyond human understanding? If NDEs are more than just hallucinations, it means there are layers of reality that we cannot yet fully access. Some spiritual traditions talk about parallel dimensions, spiritual planes where souls transit before heading to their final destinations. Could Emily's experience have been a glimpse into one of those places? And even scarier, what determines who goes to a place of light and who ends up going to a place of darkness? Many believe that what Emily saw could be some kind of notice, a reminder that life does not end with death, but continues in a state that maybe it's not the same for everyone. This raises disturbing questions. What happens to us after we die? Is there a trial, a predetermined destination? Some researchers suggest that consciousness may continue to exist independently of the brain, which would explain why people who have experienced NDEs are able to report details they could not otherwise know. There are documented cases of individuals who, upon returning to life, accurately described conversations that took place in other rooms of the hospital or saw deceased relatives that they had never met, but who later had their existence confirmed by family members. This would indicate that consciousness is not limited to the physical body and can travel beyond it. But if that's true, where exactly does this consciousness go? Emily's experience raises the hypothesis that there is more than one possible path after death. Some people seem to be guided by benevolent presences, while others are drawn to something that seems wait for them in the shadows. What if these shadows are real? What if there are entities that observe, that know who we are, and that for some reason try to pull us into the unknown? Emily returned, but was never the same. Something changed inside her, something that she can't fully explain it, but it makes her feel like the other side is still around. If what Emily saw was real, then we are dealing with a mystery much greater than we imagine. Getting this far shows that this story touched something inside you. Maybe a shiver, a memory, or even the feeling that this message came at the right time. Nothing happens by chance. Sign up now and activate the bell, because there is so much more to be revealed about the mysteries of life, death, and what lies beyond. Some experiences come to us as a sign, challenging everything we know about life and death. Do you believe that what Emily experienced was a real warning? Comment, that's a sign. Do you think science can explain it? Write, the mind creates everything. Have you ever heard a similar report? Share in the comments. Each story brings us even closer to the truth. Stories like this have the power to touch the soul and transform the way we see life and death. Leave your like now, as this message can reach and impact other people who also need to hear it. Something even more surprising is about to be revealed. A story that can change everything you believe. Click on the video that appears on the screen and discover what no one has ever told you.